Okay, we do need to talk about drugs. I'm not really going to tell you very much about drugs. I'm not going to tell you very much about drug policy. I'm surrounded by experts. You all know an incredible amount about drug policy, about criminalization, about prohibition. You know that the criminalization of people who use drugs drives catastrophic harm for communities of people who use drugs. You know that prohibition drives considerable harm, that stigmatization and discrimination towards people who use drugs, that these things are horrific. This is a room full of drug policy reform experts. What I'm going to try to convince you of is that you're not only drug policy reform experts, but that your understanding of drug policy and drug legislation means you have an understanding of legislation and policy that applies to other marginalized and subjugated communities, and that it's very, very important for us as activists, as people who work for NGOs, as academics, as researchers, to identify in solidarity with these other communities and to see the parallels in these projects and these subjugations and oppressions and projects of legislating. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about sex work legislation. I'm going to talk to you about sex work legislation in Sweden. Why Sweden? Sweden's the most influential country in the world in terms of sex work legislation. When a country thinks about changing its sex work law, it invariably looks to Sweden's criminalization of the purchase of sex. And South Africa has been thinking for between 10 and 15 years about following in Sweden's footsteps. And I think it's very, very important because everyone in this room is active, is in some way politically active. It's important for you to have an understanding in terms of how the areas on which you have expertise are also relevant to this discussion, which maybe you're not so aware of or haven't been so aware of. So please bear with me. Okay, so I conducted research on the criminalization of the purchase of sex in Sweden over a 3.5-year period, which informed my PhD and informed my first book. My second book deals with Sweden's criminalization of the use of drugs, but I'm not going to be discussing drugs, I'm going to be discussing sex work, and I'm going to repeatedly bring our discussions of sex work back in terms of how they're pertinent, in terms of our discussion of drugs, drug policy, and so forth. Okay, so I lived in Sweden for 3.5 years. I interviewed lots of people. First and foremost, of course, I spoke to sex workers. You know, if you want to find out how a piece of legislation impacts a community, I can tell you it's very, very easy. You just go and talk to that community. It's not a complicated thing. For some reason, Sweden has been unable to conduct a critical evaluation of their legislation in the almost 20 years that they've had it, but I'm not entirely sure why. Anyway, so my interview's transcribed at just under 500,000 words. It took a while, and the coding took a while. I'm going to be discussing how sex work has come to be understood in Sweden. And this understanding has been exported along with the law, and this understanding is very similar to prohibitionist understanding surrounding people who use drugs and surrounding drug use. I'm going to talk about the impacts of Sweden's criminalization of the purchase of sex. Now, you're all experts on the outcomes of criminalization. I don't know why there's still a state saying, we have this new project of criminalization that pertains to a marginalized community and trying to convince people that it's a positive thing, but lots of people are buying into this law. And then I'm going to be discussing whether the law and the policy in Sweden have been successful in their stated aim of reducing levels of sex work. Now, you're all experts on the topic of criminalization. I'm sure you know whether or not criminalization does or doesn't reduce an activity or a phenomenon like sex work or drug use or something like this. Okay, Sweden, the law in Sweden is so appealing for other countries because it means that they can posture as a country that recognizes sex work, invariably termed here prostitution, as a form of violence against women. This narrative tells us that sex work is violence against women perpetrated by men. We can see from the outset of this it's problematic because we've just invisibilized all sex workers who aren't cisgender women. This is a problem. We've just invisibilized all people who buy sex who aren't cisgender men. Anyway, so it's problematic to start with. And it, of course, constructs sex workers as disempowered victims of this type of violence. These understandings specifically impact service provision, and harm reduction for sex workers. Harm reduction isn't only for communities of people who use drugs, it also pertains to sex workers. The provision of condoms, provision of rape alarms, provision of safer sex selling information, just like provision of information that educates people as to safer ways of using drugs. I'm going to quote from some respondents here that I spoke to in Sweden. A lot of these respondents paid by the state, they're service and healthcare providers, and I really need to stress that Sweden is one of the most affluent welfare states in the world. Okay, now what this social worker has to say, this should really be sounding alarm bells, and it should sound very, very similar to a lot of what we've heard about drugs, about harm reduction for people who use drugs. Harm reduction for sex workers is many times a way of, it tends to keep people in the problem instead of helping them leave. So straight away, I mean, we can read this with an understanding of both drugs and sex work, that this understanding of the thing as in and of itself problematic means that harm reduction, service and healthcare provision comes to be opposed. In spite of this, though, the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare, they're quite savvy, and they do specify that sex workers are indeed targets in terms of harm reduction, sex workers and their clients. But condom provision for sex workers is actively opposed in Sweden. This is the National Coordinator Against Trafficking and Prostitution in a country that's exporting this law and has successfully exported this law to lots of countries and is exporting it to South Africa, one of the wealthiest welfare states in the world. If sex workers make so much money, maybe they can buy their own condoms. Okay, so there's a complete failure in Sweden to provide decent outreach to sex work. I mean, we just heard this wonderful talk just before I came up. The most fantastic outreach work. You know what? If you want to hand out services, you go into the community and you engage with the community. And this isn't complicated. Lots of nodding heads. This isn't complicated. In Sweden, there's no comprehensive outreach. This quote from a sex worker I spoke to noted that sex workers in Sweden, one of the wealthiest states in the world, are having to steal condoms. And they're having to provide one another with condoms because there's no service provision. There's no harm reduction because of this understanding, this construction of sex work. Okay, and we have this map here as what we know in terms of barriers to service and healthcare provision, that if there's a big distance between the people that you're trying to provide services to and the services will fail. We can see on this map this enormous, here we go, I have to jump. This is where the sex workers work in terms of street-based sex work, and this is the area of the prostitution unit. So lo and behold, if sex workers do want to come and get services, they can't. They have to walk for 2 hours. The services are closed at night when people are actually selling sex. There have been attempts in Sweden to give sex workers and people who buy sex, clients of sex workers, condoms. In the south of Sweden, in Malmö. The attempts weren't successful, and they didn't carry on over a long period of time. This social worker told me, we tried with condoms and it became a national issue. Not a local, but a national issue. It's very funny if you think about it, because you've got to remember, we gave out 8 condoms and it became a national issue. It was in all of the newspapers while I was in Sweden, okay? It's very basic harm reduction, very basic service provision. All of this because of how sex work has come to be understood as a form of violence. So providing condoms is seen to be a means, giving a means with which people can perpetrate this type of violence. Just as, say, giving needles and syringes is argued, we hear again and again, oh, this encourages drug use, this encourages people to use drugs, blah, blah, blah. The same rubbish relates here in terms of sex work. Okay. There have been efforts to produce a safer sex selling guide informed by the views of sex workers themselves, just like guides that we produce that have harm reduction information that enables people to use their drugs more safely. Again, this is felt, and it's exactly the parallel issue in terms of drug policy. These are felt to encourage individuals actually to begin to sell sex. The National Coordinator Against Trafficking and Prostitution told me, maybe some young girl who isn't in prostitution for the moment, they find this on the internet and say, maybe it could be really safe because I have this handbook and I have these things, so nothing could happen. And doesn't this just remind you of these ridiculous things that we read on a really regular basis? that tell us, right, we provide people with needles and syringes, we provide people with naloxone. These will encourage people to take drugs. These will encourage people to continue taking drugs. The identical narratives. Additionally, and again, a parallel in terms of drug law, discourse, understanding, and policy, with sex work in and of itself constructed as a form of violence, a form of harm, providing harm reduction information that can reduce the difficulties associated with sex work, is seen to be facile, it's seen to be futile. If something in and of itself is harmful, then if it takes place, there is harm taking place. Just as a moralization of drug use, as in and of itself harmful, leads to opposition of harm reduction services, where people say, if there's drug use happening, there's harm happening, there's no use in providing services, there's no use in providing harm reduction. This social worker, again, I really have to stress, these people have the resources to put together these safer sex selling guides. They have these materials. Prostitution in itself attracts strange people, and I think prostitution has always been and always will be really dangerous. You could replace prostitution with drug use. I think drug use has always been and always will be really dangerous. In what ways can you help someone then? What kind of information would you give to help people? The social worker asked me, what kind of information would you give to help people? This is her job. Since my knowledge tells me that prostitution is harmful, it would feel strange to give out a kit with an alarm. You go off with clients, I mean, people get raped anyway. Okay, so this is someone who's employed by the state in Sweden to provide services to sex workers and is saying that she actually has no responsibility whatsoever for trying to reduce the harms that can be associated but needn't necessarily be associated with sex work. So of course, just like communities of people who use drugs, sex workers have to learn how to avoid harms by experiencing harms themselves, by educating themselves, or by educating each other. Now, lo and behold, when you introduce a piece of criminalizing legislation, you drive harm. We know this as people who know about drug policy and drug legislation. So lo and behold, if you criminalize the purchase of sex, you're going to exacerbate other difficulties. It's not complicated. I used to talk to undergraduates who had absolutely no idea about the Swedish legislation. I says, what happens if you criminalize? You displace, you push it underground, it becomes invisible, the difficulties are exacerbated. These were 18, 19-year-olds. It's not complicated. And this should remind us of something. Obviously, negotiations in terms of street-based sex work are rushed now. Clients are worried about the possibility of arrest. What does this remind us of? If we criminalize people who use drugs, then they rush when they're shooting their drugs and when they're injecting in public spaces, and this exacerbates harm. As this respondent noted, the women say the law has made it more of a client market. It's disempowered sex workers. They have to work fast. They've got to do it kind of like in secret. They have to jump in clients' cars. They don't know what's going to happen. And as this sex worker said, you know, she has very little time now to negotiate with her clients. This is a really important period of time where sex workers can ascertain the nature of the transaction. They can negotiate with their clients. And sex workers have been disempowered in terms of reducing the avoidable harms that can be associated with sex work. And she says, and this is now more dangerous. We have to make up the transaction around the corner. She has 20 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes to negotiate with her clients. Now, I'm going to talk about whether or not the law has reduced sex work in a second. In terms of street-based sex work, fewer clients are now willing to buy sex on the street. They're worried about the possibility of arrest. Now, in terms of street-based sex workers, these are people who need the money from their sex work more urgently. They're arguably more vulnerable. They are now disempowered in terms of negotiating with their clients. And additionally, there are fewer clients to negotiate with. This has pushed up competition, therefore, in terms of the lives of the most vulnerable sex workers. This respondent said, I thought, oh my God, how should I do my work? I was working really little on the street after the law came. I got less clients, clients got more scared. So of course, with increased competition, increased financial pressure, sex work's going to become more difficult. Riskier practices are going to become more common. As this respondent noted, there are fewer clients on the streets. Women still need the money to get their heroin, for example, so customers are able to offer less money for more. No condom, for example, and if they do need the money and they have been standing there the whole night and they need their fix, then maybe they say yes. So as a result of this criminalizing legislation, it has disempowered sex workers, okay? And it's basically served to empower their clients, whilst the law purports to be a law that protects this marginalized community through only criminalizing the purchase of sex. And this is all especially concerning, given that for these sex workers, there are no resources. There's no information as to how to avoid these difficulties, as to how to avoid harm, and so forth in Sweden. Okay. When you hear the law advocated in South Africa, and you will, I guarantee you, you'll read about it in the newspapers. There are lots of service providers talking about it. There are lots of politicians saying, we recognize prostitution is a form of violence against women perpetrated by men, and we're going to do something about it through criminalizing the purchase of sex. There are assurances that the law won't criminalize sex workers. It'll protect sex workers from authoritative interference, from police involvement, and this kind of thing. The National Rapporteur for Prostitution and Trafficking in Sweden. Now, this person's the person who's going to know about policing of sex work. It's their job. It's all they do. Now, she told me the police definitely don't interfere because selling sex is not criminalized. It's not a police issue. If you want to sell, it's okay. We don't target the women or the person in prostitution. Now, I can tell you categorically that this is untrue, and this is, I believe, a willful. She willfully misspoke, and we read the testimony of politicians and Swedish police in the newspapers, and they export their legislation, and this is what we're told. The police don't interfere. I spoke to sex workers who had had the police inform their landlords that they sold sex. It's illegal to rent premises for purposes of sex work, so the police force the eviction of sex workers and the displacement of sex workers in Sweden. Police do prosecute sex workers. Sex workers who are working together for safety are prosecuted for pimping one another. There are other little pieces of legislation that are still used, and this is very similar to how bylaws are used. I was talking with the Drug User Rights Organization in Cape Town, who are telling me how bylaws are used to go after people who use drugs here, in terms of loitering laws, little laws like this that the police can use to target these marginalized communities. I guarantee you, South Africa criminalizes the purchase of sex. All the other pieces of legislation that pertain to sex work will remain, just as they have remained in Sweden. Police also report sex workers to hotels and venues, thus forcing further addictions, and police do harass sex workers directly. They go to their homes, they harass them with the prospect of arrest. Sex workers face issues with child custody, and so forth. This respondent said, they come to my door, they ask for my ID and so forth. It's like harassment. The third time, they said, we know what you're doing, what you're about. We're going to go after your clients. I make a living out of this, so I was really paranoid for a long time. And let's just go back to the National Rapporteur of Prostitution and Trafficking telling us the police definitely don't interfere. I mean, I don't want to give the game away, but we all know what happens when you criminalize. I mean, if you criminalize people who use drugs, do you decrease drug use? No, you don't. You exacerbate harm and you exacerbate difficulty. But you don't decrease drug use. The same is, of course, the case with sex work. But not only this, we're given assurances that the criminalization of the purchase of sex through focusing on demand has reduced levels of sex work. Now, I'm always, as an empiricist, very, very wary of someone telling me they can accurately measure the size of a clandestine, criminalized, subjugated, marginalized, socially excluded community, and that they can give me accurate numbers before and after they've introduced a piece of legislation that's exacerbated their social exclusion and increased their marginalization and increased the extent to which this community is clandestine. There is no evidence whatsoever that levels of sex work in Sweden have decreased as a result of the legislation. A senior advisor regarding prostitution with the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare told me to be able to tell how many people are engaging in the sex trade, according to this definition of the sex purchase law, within any particular period of time in the country as a whole. Of course, that's a very common political expectation, but it's nonsensical to anyone with basic knowledge of scientific methodology. Yet I guarantee you, whenever you hear the legislation advocated in South Africa, you will be told sex workers are protected from authoritative interference, number one. Number two, the legislation has been successful in decreasing levels of sex work. These two things are demonstrably false. Okay, so what do we learn from Sweden? Of course, through criminalization, levels haven't decreased, difficulties and danger have increased. I could have told you this before they introduced the legislation in 1999. It's really not very complicated, but Sweden does posture internationally. I can't emphasize the extent to which this is an influential law. It's been adopted in France, it's been adopted in Norway, it's been adopted in Cuba, it's just been adopted in Northern Ireland. We're actually taking the Northern Irish government to court for violating the human rights of sex workers in Northern Ireland. All right? And it's still being advocated in South Africa. It could well be adopted in South Africa. It's very, very important for people who understand the outcomes of criminalizing legislation, people who understand the outcomes of stigma, discrimination, social exclusion, criminalization, violence, authoritative involvement, that the people in this room are active in opposing such a detrimental piece of legislation with so many parallels in terms of drug-related law, policy, harm reduction, service provision, and healthcare. As this proposer of the sex purchase law, I've run out of time, so I'm going to end with this quote. As she said, I've had contacts with the UK government too, and she had also been to South Africa, and I think sooner or later they will get the Swedish legislation. When I'm meeting people from all over the world, I'm saying this is how we solved it. Now, as drug policy and legislation reformers, there should be really loud alarm bells ringing where someone tells us that they've solved a constructed problem that pertains to a marginalized community. And I can tell you it's a very, very simple thing to find out what a marginalized community means. All you need to do is go and talk to that community of people. Okay, thank you very much.